we started in 2003 at a particularly bad period in British journalism, a period of enormous crisis and a virtual stasis in training. And this was a result partly of Thatcher, partly of a whole set of commercial circumstances, the growth and development of the internet. It meant that inside the BBC, for example, there was almost no training at all. Granada Television stopped completely. Whole television operations all around the country had stopped. The Guardian stopped doing internal training at that point. There was simply no way in which young journalists could acquire the techniques and tools, the methodologies to enable the pursuit of serious factual inquiry. And so that became a crisis for us. And we decided, a group of us, who were kind of ancient figures from television, that we would somehow bumble through and train people, kind of in an amateur way, but in people's living rooms, and it kind of grew into this. And it was a good thing to do. And now we've become almost institutionalized, which is kind of weird, but true. But it also meant that we were able to bring new techniques to bear, which a lot of people in boardrooms and in editorial committees didn't like. I mean, I remember having a big chat with the editor of The Guardian and a couple of other people in The Guardian saying, what is this weird stuff you're talking about, data? What does data have to do? And of course now it's the biggest thing in The Guardian there is, and it's the biggest thing probably in the press there is. So it was an extraordinary period for us to start. But interestingly, as soon as we developed these new methods and brought them out, particularly in data and computer-related issues, the crisis in British journalism began to expand and really began to be quite serious. This was a diminution in numbers in readers, diminution in viewers, a dumbing down of almost every aspect of popular television. The slashed budgets, I made a list of these things, the drop in quality of broadcast news, current affairs, drama, even children's programs suffered. All of that went down here because they didn't want to spend the money. And they were having a shrinking base, and nobody knew what to do about it. The assumption was that if we spend more money and go down market, make it cruder or dumber, somehow we'll attract an audience. It's had exactly the opposite effect. I mean, there's an astonishing figure published by the BBC about 2 months ago, which I got from The Observer, which was astonishing, that the median age of News at 10 is now 67. 67 years old. And what does that mean? That means it's over. Because there's not enough audience there to sustain the kind of financial commitment we're really talking about, and the kind of quality of news we're talking about. It means that there's a huge, profound change coming. And nobody's dealing with it. There's no plans. There's no public discussion. None of that's going on, except perhaps in this room. And I would encourage you all to get involved in that discussion with vigor, because it's the only way that we're going to save a kind of journalism that is worth saving and developing. So print, by the way, was factionally better. Print has survived a bit better than television. Television is a kind of wasteland. We have 198 channels, and I'm being a television producer for 35 years. I had nothing to watch. And it's really, it's astonishing. And I'm not the only one here who has that reaction. I mean, I grew up in World in Action, which was an investigative program with a big budget, and we had a staff of 40. We were in 17 countries a year producing serious investigative work. There's nothing like it. People don't even know what it is anymore. So let alone the BBC, which used to have a similar thing. So with 9/11, however, it even got worse, as you know. Because with 9/11, suddenly there was political censorship. There were serious attempts to control the news output in the country. If you were a reporter in wars, like many of us have been, you were suddenly restricted. You couldn't do things without their permission. We were in bed with the generals, literally in bed with the generals. And it meant that the kind of reporting that we were used to, even in the war in Vietnam and other, was gone. We couldn't do it anymore. You had to get approval for everything. And so many networks, particularly American, bought into it. They found it very exciting. Younger reporters who didn't know much about war could sit with a guy in a civilian suit who didn't identify himself as a general, but he's actually a general in the serving general in the American Army telling you propaganda. And nobody could identify him as that. The independent media virtually collapsed for about a 7 or 8 year period into sort of government psychodrama of all kinds of political nonsense masquerading as the fact. We were told that, of course, the war in Iraq was won, that it was a successful enterprise. I mean, all the weapons of mass destruction, I mean, the lies that went on a scale that were shocking even to cynics like me and anybody else. So that together with what we began to learn of shocking atrocities Mass killings, corruption, cover-ups, torture camps, the shooting of women and children became a fact of our life. And it is, I hate to say, a reality that we confront right now. Nothing much has changed in that respect, except the cover-up is less effective. There are more people out there, compliments of all of you, who are not buying into the nonsense, but it's still there. So reporting was allowed, but only under embedded rules. Almost complete official or unofficial censorship was dominant, and nobody complained. I remember there was a period in a year in the United States when not a single reporter in a major network would say a single word about the restrictions they operated under. When your text was being reviewed, you were being censored. Official government PR people were dominating everything you did and how you did it, where you moved, how you could go, could you get on the helicopter or not, could you do all those things. That was unreported, which really meant that the audience had no idea that the news they were getting was filtered very heavily in the service of a small elite of people making gigantic sums of money. And of course that brings us to 2008, where big sums of money became what we began to talk about. And the war generated a climate, a non-critical climate, as many of you know, so that hundreds of billions a month could be stolen from treasuries, from governments, from ordinary working people in pension funds and all the rest with impunity. And we have a situation where trillions of dollars have now been looted and robbed, as we all know, from treasuries and banks and financial institutions with total impunity. You're talking about a situation where people are getting hundreds of millions a month in bonuses, and not a single person has gone to prison. Not a single person has gone to prison. That's an astonishing idea. If you steal a loaf of bread, you're going to go down. But not if you steal hundreds of billions. And so what's gone wrong here? Because that's the journalism we're supposed to be doing. What we're supposed to be doing is exposing that, telling the truth about it. And it's become increasingly difficult. I mean, there are a few little sparks of light. We know what they are. There's a bit in the Guardian or a bit somewhere else, but fundamentally, there's a silence. Nobody really goes for it. I haven't seen a single meaningful complaint about the absence of anybody in prison. I mean, they're talking about hundreds of billions a month being robbed from treasuries all around the world, through tax evasion, through everything else. We all know about it. Everybody knows about it. But who's gone to prison? Who's suffered? Who's actually paid a price for the manipulation of currencies, for the manipulation of low wages, for making sure that people don't have rights to fight back? Everyone here is in a place, because I assume of your interest in coming here, that you want to do something about it. And anything we can do to encourage you to do that, let me say, that's why we're here. Because there's a lot of work to do to document, to prove, to find evidence for these crimes. Because without the evidence, we don't have a case. So it's a very, very important obligation, and I hope many of you will jump to that opportunity. Because this isn't a bag of tricks, I should say. You know, the funny thing about investigative journalism is that some people approach it really as a kind of, I can learn a new kind of gadget, as a new kind of trick with data, or I can do something like that. That's really not what we're on about. What we're on about is telling the truth. What we're on about is discovering what is really wrong and then acting on it. And we make no bones about that. I think CIJ is particularly keen on the notion that we are responsible for what we do, we're responsible for the morality of what we do, and we have to stand up for those who don't have a voice. That's the bottom line. And there are a lot of people who don't have a voice, a hell of a lot of people. So, in that area, without going into too much history, with the collapse of social services, the collapse of living standards for lots of people in the country, we have a situation in Britain where 1/3 of the entire population is now below the official poverty line. 1/3. That's a huge number of people. In schools that are falling apart, and housing estates that are falling apart, and all the rest, all the things we know. But nobody's doing anything about it. And the exposure of that is limited. And our job, of course, is to publicize that in the most maximum way we possibly can, to make the changes that we know have to be made. Interestingly, I was trying to do some research last night on the bonuses being paid currently, right now, after all the scandals. And they're now bigger than they were 2 years ago. The bonuses that are now being paid in some of the financial houses. I mean, it's just mind-bending while this is going on. And we have got people, rickets have reappeared in Glasgow. So you've got an extraordinary situation. And nobody seems to be addressing it at all. And we have a kind of nincompoop party. I don't know which one is the nincompoop, but there are lots of them talking about nothing. And about how Britain is great again. and we need a new national anthem. And I mean, all this incredible stuff going on. Meanwhile, mainstream editors and publishers continue to support pillage, war, tyrants, inequality, and vast injustice. And nobody really knows what the alternatives are. And nobody knows that there's a genuine debate that you could have about any of this, because it isn't frequented and it isn't justified in any of the ways we know. 6 years ago, in one of the last free publishing spaces, the internet, something sprung up, and a new publisher began to challenge mainstream censorship. WikiLeaks, in this case, published indisputable documentary evidence proving mass murder, corruption, cover-ups, human rights crimes, brought before the public in many countries. In weeks, there were more scoops as a result of those disclosures than at any time in the last 40 years. In 1 week, that's how much evidence was coming out through WikiLeaks. And it was astonishing. It blew everybody's mind at all. Would any newspaper publish it? Almost none. Only one newspaper in Britain had the courage to publish any of that material. Even though there was no doubt of its veracity. There was no doubt about the truth of almost any of it. And in fact, I've never heard a serious challenge of any of it. But having said that, who would publish it? Almost no one. There was a complicity, a silence about this profound information that was extraordinarily shocking to all of us who thought this material might be of importance. And of course, we were ignored. And then The Guardian published a little bit, and a few other people published a little bit. If it was 4%, 8%, I'd be amazed. That's the percentage of the WikiLeaks material that was so shocking at the time and had such a profound effect around the world, except in Britain. Except in Britain. So it's where the press locked down in an extraordinary way with a vast campaign of abuse against WikiLeaks, against its founder, and all the rest of it. They became guilty of all kinds of sexual crimes and all sorts of stuff of the most fantastical variety, almost humorous in retrospect, but not serious, but enough to stop people publishing, stop people taking that kind of information seriously. And you'll still find, I'm sure, even in this room, people who want to believe some of that. So but you have to look very, very critically and look for evidence and use your brains to discover what's true and what isn't. But the digital door, as a result of WikiLeaks coming onto the scene, changed. It was now open even further. Edward Snowden arrived, as you know, and Snowden produced material of the most astonishing kind. And that material has never been denied at all. In fact, if anything, there's too little of it. We now know that the level of spying on the ordinary population in most Western countries, and in fact around the world, is now at a level that was almost inconceivable 5 years ago. That's how gross it is. Every single telephone conversation, every single electronic communication is being recorded, is being put somewhere in vast troves of archive material to be used against you or anybody else whenever they fancy doing it. The only thing that's preventing them so far from using that material is the complexity of the technique. It is very, very complex, given the quantities involved. You're talking about every meaningful electronic document that every person has of 3 billion people. That's a lot of people, and it's a lot of information. How do you deal with that? And that's a huge problem they have, thankfully, but we don't have. But it's a serious problem. But the fact that they do it is not a matter of public discussion. It's a matter of absolute honesty. That's what goes on. And when you talk to people in the NSA and the FBI and all the rest of it, that's the first thing you learn. That there's no limit to what they can get, because it's so cheap to do. So it means that the technique available to governments to spy on their own populations is now at a scale that was almost unimaginable even 5 or 6 years ago. The simple degree of it is quite astonishing. And yet, is there any public discussion? No. Is this an issue in any election? No. Does anybody talk about it in a meaningful way? No. Not a word. But that's the reality. So that's the reality we confront as reporters and as journalists, because that's what the world we need to report on. That's what we need to alert people to. That's the kind of danger that we are now confronting on a regular basis all the time. There's very little that you do that is of interest to them that they don't know about, surprisingly enough. The question is their ability to actually exploit that material. That's difficult, because there's so much of it. There's so vast, so the quantity is just incredible. But it's very interesting to note that the tools are being developed, and they're often being developed in extraordinary places, in Germany, in Hungary, Poland, India, Japan. There are lots of people doing really creative and interesting stuff, trying to figure out ways to use this material to gain access to the spying that's going on such a huge and unparalleled scale. There's been nothing like it in human history. The degree to which information is now being purloined by secret police, by thugs, by all kinds of bad people around the world who want to stop you from doing your job. Or if not, or encourage you if they happen to like what you're doing. But whatever it is, there's an interest there, an unwelcome interest, I should say. With the digital door now much more open than it ever has been before, we have some new and interesting problems. WikiLeaks, global leaks, 50 WikiLeaks-like programs around the world are now processing material in an extraordinary way. In little countries, even in places like Tennessee, which I regard as a little country that's on its own, Tennessee even has its own spy service trying to deal with local global leaks. So I mean, it's an extraordinary situation we now find ourselves in. And the governments are finding a very hard time dealing with it, even in China, even in Russia, places which are notoriously difficult to operate in. There are now clandestine operations of this kind going on. Anything which in fact is dedicated to the liberation of people is a very inspiring event to all of us, I think, and it's going on in the most difficult places you can imagine. So we celebrate that, and I think one of the things we want to do is to increase the technical base to enable that to expand and develop and become even more secure in the future. The tools really have offered us that have evolved from WikiLeaks and from those similar sorts of organizations around the world have been of extraordinary utility in protecting journalists. I mean, we now know that even though thousands of journalists have been arrested as a result of secret police purges in the Third World and in some of the former East Bloc, nonetheless, there's better reporting of a more substantive kind than we've ever seen before. So it's very encouraging. And I don't want to go on at great length here, but I wish to say a few things, only that what our obligations are, what we feel they are, and what we need to do. We hope that the technical skills that you'll get here will be of help to you. And if you need more, we're here to provide them. Just tell us. We need to expand what we do and make it better and bring it to a higher level all the time. Our kind of journalism is really not about balance and close quotes fairness and the usual traditional means by which people abrogate what they say. It's not about that. It's about telling the truth. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's the fundamental purpose of meetings like this and every one of the kinds of things we do. Because the purpose is solely that. If we're successful in that, we're successful in what we're here to do. And so it's a matter of enormous power to us that we can convince as many people as possible to stand up and tell it like it is. That's the hardest thing of all, particularly in a society which doesn't particularly value that except in rhetoric. In rhetoric they do, but not in reality. The last thing people want is anybody to tell the truth about what's often going on. And our job is to make sure that does get out. So we're going to offer you, in the days ahead, as many technical skills as you can take on board, with as much skills as we can hopefully provide, so that you can do the job you need to do, which is to go out and tell the truth. So it's with that, I'll just say a welcome to everybody. We're delighted everybody's here, and more power to you all.